A lot of people like to say education doesn't stop at school. We like to say real education doesn't start at school. I'm Brett Venat,
And I'm Nathan Frazier.
and this is Mindset and Mastery.
Okay, Brett, I loved your old podcast, School Sucks, just because of the name, School Sucks. I hated school. I didn't hate learning. I loved learning. I've always been a self-directed type learning guy, but I totally agreed with the name of the podcast, School Sucks. And today I wanted to pick your brain about being an autodidact, tips for being better at self-directed learning, because a lot of people, we need someone to direct us as we're learning. And I get that for most people, or a good significant amount of people, the school system works a little bit for that need. But for people like me and a lot of the people I work with, a lot of the entrepreneurs and business owners that I work with, sitting down and just regurgitating facts is not the best way for them to learn. So I wanted to talk to you today about autodidacts and self-directed learning and some tips on how we can be better at it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the people we're talking to really need to be able to put what is learned into practice, often very quickly. And school and college and graduate school and even PhD programs really don't help people do that, right? They really don't translate from, here's what you're learning to here's what you're doing in a really efficient kind of way. So, a lot of times when people pursue self directed education, it's with some kind of purpose in mind. They have some kind of clear outcome. And I think that that is a really important distinction between teaching yourself and being, I don't even want to say being taught, being schooled. I have a lot I could say, as you know. I said 12 years worth of things about this topic. But one of the reasons why I named the show School Sucks is I really feel like that process sucks out of too many people the best teacher that we are ever going to have, which is our own curiosity. And the more we outsource decision making, direction, practice, evaluation to other people through a pretty arbitrary like rating system of grades, the further away we get from our natural capacity to self-teach, right?
Mhm.
And to self-direct in all kinds of ways in life. So I think this is a really, really important subject. School is not one of the sexier issues. So a lot of the damage that school and higher so-called education do is really left unexplored by a lot of people, and they don't go back and kind of examine, I would say, what happened to them in the 15,000 hours of compulsory schooling, plus whatever additional schooling in the form of college they added on to that. Now, you and I have very different experiences, and I think it would be interesting to maybe compare and contrast.
Yeah, so I dropped out in kindergarten. I
Yeah,
decided very early on that school was not for me. Was
favorite.
forced I was forced to go back and didn't spend very much time in school. As soon as I learned how to ditch school, it just became a habit, and that was, like I said, very first year of school. Didn't really like most of my teachers. I had one or two teachers, though, that did make an impact on me and did make learning a good experience for me inside of the schoolhouse. But most of my education, especially once the internet became available, most of my education became, oh, I can teach myself this stuff, or I can find people who understand it a lot better than the person who's just a couple of steps ahead of me at the head of the class. And so for me, I just never really liked school. And as soon as I was able to legally drop out, at the time I was homeless and working full time to try and keep food in my mouth and figure out how to put a roof over my head. And so I dropped out of school when I was 17 years old and didn't go to college, didn't ever look back. And from that point forward, though, like I said, that was about when the internet started coming into being, and I started discovering, oh, I can find all of these books, and I can find all of these teachers from all over the world, and I can find different courses and different PDFs and different trainings. And I quickly learned that by wanting to learn things and by going out and finding the educational material for myself, it was a shortcut to gaining the knowledge. It was a little bit difficult, though. I want to talk about some of those difficulties today, not having the path just laid out for me by somebody else. But I found that for me, at least, I was able to build a career in a field that I love, making a lot of money, and I didn't have to go the route of stay in school, get good grades, go to college, go into debt, and then you'll find that career that you will be well paid and enjoy life with.
Yep. And me, on the other hand, I did everything wrong. Best I can do to match up with your story is when I was in 12th grade, I snatched a pack of hall passes from the main office at the school. I learned a handful of teacher signatures, and then I had a little, I think it was basically volunteer work or charity work where I would just sign people. I would give out passes with signatures on them to sign people out of study halls. I would usually sign myself senior year out of school, like second or third period, and me and my friend would go test drive cars. That's what we did. So I was there in spirit, but ultimately I submitted. I graduated from high school. I went to the 13th grade, which is college. I got a bachelor's degree. I realized that didn't mean anything, even in the year 2000. So I went back to school for a master's program in education and teacher certification. I did all that. So I wasn't clear of this system until like age, oh God, 26, 27. I think was my last year in college. And yeah, these are not institutions that are very good at trimming fat or minimizing waste. So one of the huge benefits, aside from not, having enormous amounts of college debt or, wasted time, is that when you are pursuing a path of self-directed education, you become a very good steward of your own time. You learn to value your own time, which the schools definitely do not do. There is a tremendous amount of wasted time in schools, and nobody really seems to care about that. Yeah, I went the traditional route and eventually even went into education and started wasting other people's time and did that for a number of years. And eventually, my frustration overcame me, and I started the School Sucks podcast. And I started trying to do some repair work. I started trying to give back.
So I want to clarify, at least from my point of view, for me and for probably a lot of you listening, and definitely for you, Brett, the way that school works now and the way that business and jobs work probably is suited for the majority of people out there. A lot of people don't want to make these hard decisions for themselves. A lot of people don't want to take on the responsibility for their own learning. A lot of people want to just show up, be told what to do, and then go home. And I don't know if I would say that they're trained to be that way. I think that it's just the way most people are. And that fact is exploited both in the workplace and in the education system. And so I want to clarify, at least from my point of view, the school system works for most people that just want to be told what to do, which is, in my experience, the majority of people. The school system is perfect for them. But for independent thinkers, for people who do want to take on some extra responsibility and over how their life turns out or how their days are spent or what they are learning and embodying in their own lives, the school system definitely doesn't work for all of us.
Oh, absolutely. Well, it is, I would say, the most successful government program possibly ever. Yes, many people there, it does not work for them long term. And I think a lot of the things that we're actually seeing in the adult world, in the professional world, are outcomes at school. I always said that the three hidden lessons of school are obedience, which is basically the surrendering of personal responsibility, conformity, which is the surrendering of personal identity, And when you are, I don't know, forced to do those things, even subtly, like day after day, year after year, the condition, the third hidden lesson of school is a kind of intellectual and philosophical apathy, right? You've given all this other responsibility away. So people go out into the work world expecting somebody to take care of them. And in exchange, they'll be told what to do. So that's why the entrepreneurial mindset is hard for a majority of people. That's why even when people, embrace entrepreneurship, they still struggle. I still struggle with a lot of schooled mindsets that I haven't like cleared yet. I don't know if you feel the same way. I mean, you knew in kindergarten you had to get out of there. I understand you went back. It would have been a great story if that was it, just kindergarten and he was out. But I don't know if you ever feel the impact of those demands for obedience and conformity, like, creeping into your thinking in any way, but I certainly do.
I do. And like I said, I think that it's kind of human nature. I think that if every human evolved to all be independent thinkers and to all be self directed learners and self directed business type people, if we all evolved to be that way, I don't think that society would have been possible. I don't think that the
Yeah.
tribe would have been possible. So I think that all of us have it in us a little bit, and school definitely plays on that and brings it to the forefront of the way that most people think. So yeah, even myself, I'm sometimes, I don't want to say guilty of it, but I definitely feel it slip in a little bit. That sounded perverted, but yeah, I fall victim to it as well, even though I'm very much in the line of don't tell me what to do, don't boss me around, I'm going to be my own boss. I very much have that mentality, but yeah, I still have parts of my life where I'm like, can I expert just please tell me what to do here?
Amen. Absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's important that we don't cast school as like the singular villain in this problem that many of us have as adults. Like you said, the schooling system exploits these things. In many cases, it exacerbates these things. And what these things are is a natural tribal impulse that humans have. And when we're young and we're in school, the top of our hierarchy of needs, like when we start school, is safety and belonging. And we get those things by obeying and conforming, right? Like that's taught in school, but that is instinctual in us going into school as well. So, yes, we're going to transition into our top 5 tips. This could have been top 40 tips, top 100 tips. There's so many different directions we could have gone here, but the top 5 tips for self directed learners or autodidacts. And I just wanted to talk for a minute about who these tips are for. Obviously, as a proponent of, educational alternatives, unschooling, homeschooling, alternative schools where self directed learning is the focus, this is something that I would like to see happening everywhere, at all ages. So it's a difficult thing to generalize. It really, really comes down to individual strengths and needs and deficits. So what we're going to be talking about here is tailored to our audience for mindset and mastery, which is adults, people who are probably busy, people who are most likely skill focused. And I wanted them to also be more mindset tips than we're going to talk a little bit of practicality, uh, but you can really, really get deep into like what is the optimal setting, light conditions, how should your office be set up, what kind of tools should you use. But we're going to stay a little bit bigger picture here and focus on the mindset stuff. And I also shared something with you that I wanted to share with the audience. It was just like a pie chart of challenges, like the most common struggles that people have with lifelong learning and self education. Self doubt is a huge one. Procrastination is probably the biggest one. Lack of commitment, lack of focus, and problems with memory. So, in these 5 tips, I want to do the best we can here to address each one of those major challenges as well.
And I just want to jump in real quick. Procrastination on the pie chart is the number one thing. And for me, also, procrastination is usually the number one villain that I have to struggle against. And more often than not, procrastination just comes from uncertainty. I don't know how to handle something. It's kind of intimidating. It's new to me, or even if it's not new to me, I'm still a little bit scared of it because it's this. I feel like I'm being asked to walk into a dark room. There's no light on, and I might stub my toe. I might step on a Lego. And so for me, procrastination usually comes from that. I don't want to walk into the dark room because I don't know what's on the other side of the door. And that's one of the things that school alleviates for a lot of people is don't worry about it. We've got these experts at the front of the room and they're going to turn the light on for you. They're going to point out all of the sharp edges and Legos that you might step on. So again, going back to why school is so appealing for the majority of people, one thing that we have to deal with as self-directed autodidacts is that we have to step into dark rooms a lot, and school helps alleviate that pain. And being a self-directed learner, you're dealing with it all the time, and you just have to learn how to just, put on your big girl panties and step into the dark room and overcome that procrastination.
Yeah. School classrooms are I would say overly lit with some very uncomfortable lighting. They're also cracking that whip there too, which is a nice remedy for procrastination. Like you don't get to take your own time. You're in 45-minute increments divided by bells. You get 4 minutes in the hall. You've got a couple hours of homework that you have to deal with when you get home. And there's consequences if you don't do that. So once you become self-directed or self-employed or even self-educating, all of those threats are removed, right? And we're kind of left to our own devices. And I know that that is a very big and common problem. It is probably, like you, the biggest problem that I have. So the first two tips that I want to provide both address procrastination in some way. The first is achieve clarity. Now, you said a lot of the time when we procrastinate, it's because we don't know the next thing that we're supposed to do. So, to go all the way out to the big picture, I think it's really, really important to have a kind of mission statement that will keep you focused on what your specific goals are for learning something. And that can help prevent you from getting sidetracked. But there's other questions that are more big picture to answer there as well. Like, are you a generalist? Are you learning about a very broad topic? Are you a specialist? Are you trying to learn something very specific, like a coding discipline? I don't want to try to give examples. It's not my world. But are you tackling something in order to build a new skill? Is this pleasure? Is there potentially a profit in what you're doing? And maybe like envisioning the end and trying to see what lies on the other side of this and clarify as much as possible is very important. So it's not just clarity at the end, it's clarity at the beginning with knowing the mission and the path that you have to walk. So that's number one.
I just want to add to that. This is a reoccurring theme on Mindset and Mastery is achieving clarity on your goals, on who you want to be as a person, on what you want to learn. All of these things, the first step is always achieving clarity. And again, this is something in marketing, the same thing. On every marketing campaign, we need to achieve clarity. We need to know who exactly we're talking to, what exactly they're trying to accomplish. And if you don't have that clarity, it's so hard to set out on any kind of navigation. If you don't know where you're trying to go, it's impossible or very intimidating to start out on the journey.
Yeah. So, another part of that that's really important too. I think we recently did "Feeling Is the Secret" by Neville Goddard, and that actually lines up with a lot of like self-limiting belief deletion kind of practices. There's something called the Lefco Method, which is where people like call into their consciousness their persistent self-limiting beliefs and kind of reason their way out of them. And there's lots of different ways this is done. But what's really, really important to that is the kind of somatic experience of feeling yourself being free of that, or in Goddard's sense, feeling yourself achieving the thing you want. So you can lie in bed all night trying to feel this thing or feel the satisfaction, feeling the wish fulfilled, as you've said, that's on the other side of all this work. But if you don't have clarity on what that thing is, you're not going to really be able to feel, to somatically experience what that's like. So getting as much, and that's going to change along the way too. Like, I think one of the reasons why people balk at this idea is they're like, well, I'm going to learn new stuff and things are going to change. That's fine. You can adapt as the process goes on. But, in the beginning, making your best effort at getting the clarity of what the end looks like is well worth your effort. And I think I've had so many unfinished products because I didn't envision the end. Like I keep track of everything in Evernote and I have like a someday maybe or projects incomplete. And there's hundreds of things in there. It's not like I never got anything done, but, and it's not like I could have gotten everything that I conceived of done either, but more things could have been done through the years, through over the last decade, had there been a clear end in mind that I was able to envision. So that brings us on to number 2, also dealing with procrastination, and it is strengthen your frustration and overwhelm tolerance.
Mhm.
So I think it was probably like, oh, geez, like 8 years ago, I read this book called The First 20 Hours How to Learn Anything Fast. And it was by Josh Kaufman. And what Kaufman wanted to do was provide a counter argument to this idea that I think Malcolm Gladwell put forward, that you need 10,000 hours invested to become a true expert of something. And, Kaufman's response was like, that's really overwhelming. And that's almost like, shooting somebody in the leg at the starting line to tell them they need, I mean, 10,000 hours is 5 solid years of full time work, right?
Mhm.
Assuming we work, 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year. That's 5 years of full time work to master some new skill. Now, what Kaufman suggested was see what you can do by being very deliberate, very present, very conscious in the first 20 hours of engagement with something new. So, a quote from the book: pushing through the early frustration involved a few simple techniques. First, I pre committed to putting in at least 20 hours of practice, which made it much easier to persist when the going got rough instead of quitting at the first sign of difficulty. And again, that syncs up with number 1 nicely. If we haven't defined anything beyond the frustrating moment we're in right now, that frustration might be enough to stop us right there. Kaufman continues. Second, I learned just enough about the core concepts to start writing real programs. So he's talking about doing some kind of programming thing instead of spending a ton of time completing canned tutorials. Third, I broke my program into smaller parts, then worked on one at a time until the software worked, testing and fixing bugs along the way. So, at that second one, to start doing real work, this is the opportunity that school, in a lot of higher education, especially in like the social sciences, we don't get that opportunity. We really don't get that opportunity in school. We're taking quizzes and tests or filling out worksheets, but not doing anything that gives us meaning. One of the names that we wanted to work into this conversation was John Taylor Gatto, who I know has been a big influence on both of us from afar. Gatto was a middle school teacher in Harlem in the 70s and the 80s, and maybe even into the 1990s. And even though he did things that were against the law as a teacher, like they'd certainly be against the law now. They were against the law then. He would let kids go out of school and he would give them adult mentors, and the kids would shadow like truck drivers or dispatchers to see how their effort would translate into real world results. So they could feel their impact, the impact of their effort on the real physical outside world, which was an opportunity that nobody else in that school that he taught in really got. So he would send kids into reality from school. And that resulted, I think, for a lot of them who embraced that opportunity in meaning. So part of Kaufman's advice that I like here, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this strengthening frustration and overwhelm tolerance, is to start producing as soon as possible, certainly imperfectly. Certainly imperfectly. And I like this idea. Kaufman says 20 hours. I say commit to one full day and not like, 24 hours straight or one full work day, but 24 hours spread over a period of time in neat intervals of time, like say a week or two. I wouldn't stretch it more than like a month because, if you're doing only like a half hour a day, that might not be sufficient engagement or practice in whatever you're doing. So making that commitment to, I'm not going to give up on this pursuit until I have invested this amount of time, I think is a really important promise to make to yourself at the start of some new endeavor.
Mhm. I think what I really like about this is there's this meme amongst the entrepreneurial world, which is like everything that is worth having in life is right outside of your comfort zone. Everything that you want is right outside of your comfort zone. In order to get it, you have to step outside of your comfort zone. Theorizing, learning, reading, taking courses, all of that stuff it fits nicely within the comfort zone. Going out and actually practicing and implementing what you learn is where you have to step outside of that comfort zone. And that's when the stuff actually starts to stick. You can read all day, you can theorize all day, but it's not until you actually go out and implement and practice the stuff that you're learning about that it actually sticks, that it actually starts to make a difference. But that is very uncomfortable. So strengthening the ability to get uncomfortable, I think, should also be part of this step number 2.
That is a huge part of it. I loved making this list and I loved putting number 2 on there because I would say this is one of my biggest struggles. Like historically and right up to the present moment, where I'll be, taking notes and researching and going, I'm working, I'm doing something. But that's kind of an illusion, right? If it's not actually producing the thing that I set out to produce. We can tell ourselves we're working because we're going through the motions of work, but something changes once we go into production mode. Production mode will force us back into this like just in time kind of learning mode where it's like, okay, we already started, things are in motion, we don't have everything we need. So the forward momentum continues. And then when we find time, we have to jump back to, fill in what we don't know as we continue to try to go forward. But if you are inert, if you're in analysis paralysis, you haven't started moving forward yet. So you can just continue to expand that space of investigation and research, and play, without actually producing anything longer and longer and longer. And I know what that's like. I've done that on several projects. So just getting enough to get going, which is what Kaufman suggests in that book, and then you start moving forward. That's really, really important. It's worth talking about here at number 2 when we're talking about like frustration and overwhelm tolerance. Don't overload your resources. Be smart about your choices, definitely have some variety. And a really important attribute of a self-directed learner is the ability to do integration. We see how bad people are, especially on like social and political issues right now, on the practice of integration, meaning taking numerous viewpoints and evaluating each one and making their own individual coherent picture out of those things, right? Most people, like, we see how siloed information is. We see how echo chambered information is. People are not even making attempts to do this. Debate on a lot of like social and political issues has ended, right? There's no forum for it anymore because people have lost this integrative capacity. So as a self-directed learner, yeah, you want to be like looking at differences in different sources of information. You also want to be looking at similarities. You want to be removing contradictions, and you want to be building a coherent picture out of more than just one source of information. That is integration. And I think like presence and like, living consciously comes into it right there, where, are you looking for a path of least resistance? Are you looking for things that confirm what you already believe? And really, really trying to integrate maybe things that are uncomfortable, or things that's, this is going to come up later in the conversation too, things that are extremely challenging. Because when we have a lot of different directions we can go in a new pursuit, there might be a resistance to challenge, to that discomfort. So, making a pledge to yourself that I'm going to try and integrate all of these things, regardless of frustration, regardless of discomfort, I think is really, really important to keep the ball rolling.
And I just want to add to that, a rule that I've set for myself as far as my self-directed learning in any aspect of life goes is I don't buy a new book until I finish the last book. I don't buy a new book or a new course until I've actually implemented something that I learned from the last book or the last course. Because again, all of that stuff can start to get overwhelming. If you've taken in 4 books or 4 courses on something and you haven't implemented anything, you haven't actually put out some of that energy that you've been taking in, it can start to get overwhelming. It can start to get to the point where you get what you called earlier the analysis paralysis. So before I allow myself to buy a new book, before I allow myself to buy a new course on any particular subject, I generally force myself to finish what I just bought or I just took on, and then I start putting out some stuff. So it's not always just input. There's also output. What goes in has to come out. And if you don't have that output, you can start to get overwhelmed really easily.
Yeah, absolutely. So the third one, very important as well, organize and personalize. I think too often we have a habit of just diving in, and we need to be more self-aware about our learning strengths and weaknesses, our learning style. So I have a lot of really smart friends, and this is actually another thing that happens here, is we might just dive in based on somebody else's glowing recommendation of something. So I have some really smart friends who might be like, "Oh, you really need to listen to this 12-hour lecture series on the philosophic corruption of physics. It's fantastic." And I'll go, okay, if you say so, and maybe get 30 minutes into it and be completely lost, or realize this isn't for me, or this isn't working for me in some way. So, like those kinds of questions that we, at least like when I was a teacher, we took a stab at these things for a lot of the students that we were writing individualized education plans for. Like, are they, a visual learner? Are they an auditory learner? Are they more tactile in their learning? Do they need to be like, physically manipulating things in their environment? For me, just listening to a bunch of lectures, I'm not going to retain most of that information, right? I need things to be visual, and I also need a certain, and I would say a pretty high level of engagement, like taking notes, mind mapping, all of those things are really, really important to me. And I've learned that that has to be part of my system if I expect to like actually encode things efficiently into my memory. Another really important part of that is having a reliable capture system that you know how to use. So I use Evernote to keep track of basically everything that I do. That's a whole separate video, but you need to have a system of integration, of collection, integration, and ultimately output that that you like, and that you trust. I think that's really, really important. For me, it's Evernote. Some people use OneNote or Notion. There's a whole bunch of options. People love to do mind maps, drawing pictures and diagrams. I think whatever it is, priority needs to be like maximizing your interaction, your physical and mental back and forth interaction with whatever the topic is, to get more of your brain involved. And I also really think that a some kind of like periodic review system is important. So I do like audiobooks, despite what I just said about getting nothing out of lectures. But, I'm driving, I'm working out, and I can't be sitting there reading while I'm doing those things. So, an audiobook is, the medium that I'm going to use. I have a program called Scribd. It's about $10 a month. It used to be just like a free place where people put up PDFs. But now Scribd has become a service that I would say is competitive with Audible, but it's, not just audiobooks, PDFs, EPUBs. There's all kinds of stuff there. It's like $10 a month. And when I find an audiobook, there's a really cool feature on Scribd where you can just hit a button and it'll bookmark that spot. So I already know from the tips we've covered that I'm reading a book with a certain purpose. There's something that I want to get out of that book. So where I'm putting a bookmark, it means that this excerpt or this couple minutes of audio serves my purpose for reading this book. So the periodic review would be to go back, open all the bookmarks and just listen to them and maybe transcribe things or take notes. So it takes me some time to be engaged with one book. Blessed are those who can just read an audiobook and pick up all the important information, but it's a little bit more of you know, the time consuming and deliberate process for me. But that would be an example of a kind of periodic review to make sure that you're really like encoding things that you're going to need later.
Yeah, and for me, it goes back to what we were just talking about. I love audiobooks. I think audiobooks are my favorite way of learning things. But immediately after I consume the audiobook, I start implementing the stuff, or even as I'm consuming the audiobook, I'm implementing the stuff into my life, into my work, into my practice. And the listening and implementing is the two key factors for me. I think it's different for everybody, but definitely finding how do you absorb this stuff? How do you best solidify what you're absorbing is key to being an autodidact or a self-directed learner.
Absolutely. Yep. The fourth one I called work at your edge. And what I mean by this is make sure that you are challenging yourself sufficiently. We talked about managing frustration. I would say here we're actually talking about leveraging frustration for more neuroplasticity. And just as an example, it doesn't work obviously exactly the same way, but think about getting muscle growth from working out. You expand your muscles over time by tearing them apart, by failing at exercises. You don't want to do this every single time you try to lift a weight because that would be incredibly frustrating and quickly damaging to your body. But you do want to be running into errors, like to stay at your edge. You want to be running into errors. Everything shouldn't just seem like a breeze. There should be places where you get stuck, and that's a place to kind of let motivation build up to push through that challenge. And again, it's like if you already have momentum towards some kind of pursuit, whether it's intellectual or physical, if that momentum is already there, running into that challenge is a very, very good thing for motivation. So there is a guy, get into him if you want. I think he is a neuroscientist. He has a podcast called Huberman Lab where he talks about the science behind a lot of these things like attention, productivity, etc. The quote that I include from him, he says, "When we fail to do something, our attention levels increase. That increase can be leveraged to heighten learning capacity on subsequent attempts. Scientific findings suggest that setting the level of challenge to one where you make errors about 15% of the time is ideal for learning." So that is the idea of working at your edge. There's another book called The Art of Learning that is very popular by Josh Whiteskin. And he was a chess player, among other things. A couple of quotes from him. The key to pursuing excellence is to embrace an organic long-term learning process and not to live in a shell of static, safe mediocrity, i.e. school. Usually growth comes at the expense of previous comfort or safety. And then continuing that idea, another quote from the same book, growth comes at the point of resistance. We learn by pushing ourselves and finding what really lies at the outer reaches of our abilities, unquote.
So, two things. Number one, again, back to the idea of going outside of the comfort zone. In exercise, it's important to push yourself past what you're comfortable with. In learning, it seems like it's a very similar thing. The further you can push yourself outside of your comfort zone, the more you expand your comfort zone. Second thing, how much must it suck to live in 2022 social justice era and have the last name white skin?
Oh yeah, when I first heard that, I was like, "Whoa, that's tough." But it's actually, especially if people want to look Josh Whiteskin up. Fortunately for Josh Whiteskin, his name is spelled Waitzkin.
All right, just to clarify that.
You might want to think about the pronunciation, though.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I first heard about that book years ago from a young philosopher and mathematician named Steve Patterson, and he swore by. He said this is one of the. He was on my show, and we did a series called "Principles of Learning Anything," and he said this was one of the most foundational books that he read on the subject of self-directed learning. Again, it is called "The Art of Learning."
All right,
Go ahead.
number 5.
Number 5 is begin with a mindset of mastery. So this is like the Stephen Covey idea of begin with the end in mind, which we've already talked about. And I would say that it is, worth your while to, whenever you pick up to learn something new, learn it as if you were going to become a master of it one day. And I think for a lot of people, that completely changes the way they approach the learning. We are schooled often to dread things that are difficult, to dread things that are frustrating, because there's nothing really good on the other side of them, right? It's just like the next thing we need to do to stay out of trouble. So all of our motivation is extrinsic. Nothing is really coming from within. So when you run into these challenges, you'll actually find, if you can really embrace and believe this mindset, you'll become more eager to expand your potential. Instead of becoming like bored or frustrated, you'll be curious and challenged to figure out like what is on this other side of what you don't know. Hopefully, if all goes well and you can really, really embrace this, instead of like losing motivation or becoming apathetic in those or walking away completely when the going gets tough, you'll welcome those kinds of challenges, that kind of resistance, because you've decided that there is mastery on the other side of it, even if there isn't. Like beginning with that mindset of mastery, even if you are not going to become like the best at the world in the world at something, like setting yourself up that way and envisioning yourself being really competent at something new, I think is a very, very powerful motivator that has worked for me several times in life.
I feel like anything that you set out to do in life, the biggest barrier is the one that's in your own mind. The self-limiting belief is always going to be where you stop at. So if you set the barrier at 2 feet, say you're going for a long jump, you're running and you're jumping into a patch of sand and you're trying to do a long jump. If you set your possibility at 2 feet, you might not make it to 2 feet, but you'll never make it past 2 feet. And if you set it at 6 feet, you might not make it to 6 feet, but you'll never make it past 6 feet. So usually, pretty consistently actually, wherever you set that limit is where you're going to stop at. Even if that's not the true limit, even if that's not the true ending of your potential, where you set the limit, where you say, I'm going to get this good at this. This is where I'm possibly going to get to in this particular endeavor. I'm going to be somebody who's proficient, or I'm going to be somebody who kind of can sort of do this thing. If that's where you set your limit at, that's as far as you're going to ever go. But if you say, I'm going to be a master at this thing, you might not actually be a master, but you have a lot better chance of coming close to mastery than if you set off on that journey with the expectation of, I'm going to kind of understand this thing.
Yep. And the best way, I think, to start getting around those self-imposed artificial limits is to get inside the mindsets of the masters, the top performers of in the field that you're pursuing, and understanding, like how they think, what skills they have, how do they execute, what do they tell themselves, because then you're already seeing what's beyond your self-limiting beliefs. And the more of that you can integrate into your own thinking, I think the more inspiration can outweigh self-imposed limitation, right? It doesn't mean that there isn't going to be some tug of war there, right? Because you'll start telling yourself stories like, well, I mean, I'm not Tony Robbins, things like that. Not that you're trying to be Tony Robbins, but whoever it is, in whatever field it is. Like if you're comparing yourself to the best, there is going to be negative self-talk that creeps in, but welcome it, realize what it is, and just try to embrace and integrate as much of those top performer mindset pieces that resonate with you as you can to kind of break through those barriers you're creating for yourself.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we went through a lot of stuff today, and I feel like we delivered, mostly you delivered a wealth of information on how to be a better self-directed learner. And the last one began with a mindset of mastery. I want to use that as a way to plug and transition into an offer that we have for the listeners. If you want to learn more about how to master yourself and the world around you, we do have a free training for you that will help you get set down that road. And you can find that, coincidentally enough, over at mindsetandmastery.com. So if you enjoyed this episode, you want to catch more episodes like this, or you want to get a free training that we have for you, head over to mindsetandmastery.com. Brett, thank you so much for putting all of this together, man. You definitely did most of the heavy lifting on this week's episode, and I appreciate you putting all of this together and bringing it to both myself and to the listeners. And as a longtime listener of your old podcast, The School Sucks Project, this was the best. This was what kept me coming back every week, was the fact that you had almost a religious mission to get this message out, that you can learn outside of the school system, and taking those years and of hard work and kind of refining it down to these 5 points. It was very valuable for me. So thank you for putting it together, man.
Oh, it was my pleasure. This is one of my favorite subjects, and I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Awesome. All right. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, make sure that you're subscribed on your favorite podcast app, or over on YouTube, or wherever else we might place the videos for this podcast at. And again, one more last plug, mindsetandmastery.com. And until next time, we will catch you later.
See you later.